the fixed resource requirement alternative to PJM's capacity market, addressing state authority to support clean sources of energy generation. Hosted by NYU Law's State Energy and Environmental Impact Center with Synapse Energy Economics. My name is Hampton Macbeth, and I'm a staff attorney at the State Impact Center. And I'll be the host and moderator of the webinar today on behalf of the State Impact Center. Our center works with state attorneys general on clean energy, climate, and environmental matters. As you know, in December 2019, FERC issued an order that materially changes the capacity market rules for PJM, the regional transmission organization that coordinates the movement of wholesale electricity in 13 eastern and Midwestern states and the District of Columbia. More specifically, the order sets a price floor, the minimum offer price rule, or MOPR, that will disqualify state-supported clean energy resources from the capacity market. The MOPR rule directly undercuts state clean energy policies and states' legal prerogatives to shape the energy system of their choice under the Federal Power Act. It has triggered questions from states regarding the whethers and hows of potentially opting out of the capacity market by taking advantage of the so-called fixed resource requirement alternative in PJM. To help states and other stakeholders in and out of PJM better understand these issues, the State Impact Center is partnering with Synapse Energy Economics, a research and consulting firm specializing in energy, economic, and environmental topics, to put on this webinar and to produce a guide for states as they consider the pros and cons of pursuing the FRR alternative. After this webinar, Synapse will be preparing a related guide, which we will be posting on our website at the center later this spring. Joining us today from Synapse is Dr. Steve Latendre, Jason Frost, and Courtney Lane. Dr. Latendre will provide a brief introduction to Synapse and an overview of the webinar. His colleagues will then discuss the FRR alternative and related issues, leaving the last 10 minutes or so for questions. If you have questions, please enter them through the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom application. The questions should automatically be entered in a format that keeps the identity of the question asker private in order to encourage a free exchange of ideas and questions. We are doing this webinar remotely today, so we appreciate your patience with any technical difficulties we may have. And now I'm going to turn the webinar over to Dr. Latendre. Take it away.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Everyone can see my slides okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Hampton, so much for the introduction. We're pleased to be here this afternoon to share with you our research and our analysis of the, as Hampton mentioned, the FERC MOPR, which was issued, MOPR order, which was issued towards the end of 2019. As he mentioned, there'll be 3 presenters, myself, Jason, and Courtney, and then Max Chang, as also with Synapse, will be joining us for the question and answer session at the end. I want to begin by just giving you a quick introduction to Synapse Energy Economics, if you're not familiar with our work. We are based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we have about 30 plus consultants that cover a wide range of energy and environmental topics. In economics, modeling in particular is our expertise. And we have emerged as one of the leading providers of rigorous analysis, serving a variety of public interest and governmental clients. And those clients include public utility commissions, state energy offices. We've also worked for a number of AG offices across the country. We also provide consulting services to the nonprofit sector, environmental groups. And we've also, over the years, have also done work for a variety of for-profit energy companies. So we provide to you on the right of this slide coverage of the various topics that we address in our consulting, everything from integrated resource planning for electric utilities, renewable and distributed energy generation, economic analysis, energy and capacity markets, which is the topic of our webinar this afternoon. So the webinar, we're going to cover three high-level topics. I'm going to begin by describing PJM's capacity market, how it's structured, and what the anticipated impacts will be based on FERC's December 2019 MOPR order, the minimum offer price rule. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason, who will talk about one, if not one, of the only responses that states have at their disposal to address some of the potential negative implications of FERC's MOPR order. And he will describe the FRR Alternative, and then upon completion of that, he's going to pass it over to Courtney, and Courtney will be presenting different state actions and legislation that might be considered to support states that want to pursue the FRR Alternative to continued participation in PJM's capacity market. So that's the general overview of the webinar. So I will go ahead and get started. So PJM's capacity market is referred to as the reliability pricing model. So the RPM is specifically designed to make sure that PJM has access to adequate capacity resources into the future. So they were talking about generating assets that produce and deliver power to the PJM region. So this is an important issue in terms of reliability. PJM is looking to the future and anticipating what the peak demand will be for electricity within its region, and also will add on to that what we call a reserve margin to the anticipated peak demand for electricity. And again, this whole capacity market is designed to assure that there's sufficient capacity in the future based on anticipated demand for electricity plus that reserve margin. Given the physical footprint of PJM, the transmission system does create some constraints. There are constraints in terms of the ability to transfer power from one part of PJM to the other zone of PJM. So there are what we call zonal capacity requirements. So the market will establish specific amounts of capacity that are required in particular regions within PJM, and the markets are designed to accommodate that. So on the supply side, you've got companies that own generating capacity. There's a variety of different merchant plant owners, electric utilities that own power generation that's physically located within PJM, and they offer that capacity to the market, and that creates the supply curve, which is that blue curve that you see at the bottom of that chart. On the demand side, PJM produces a demand curve, and they use what they call a variable resource requirement, which is distinct from the FRR, which Jason will be discussing. The variable resource requirement, you see there on the demand curve, that it's what economists call purely inelastic, meaning PJM is willing to pay as much as is required to attract the amount of capacity that is needed to meet its future anticipated peak demand plus the reserve margin. And past that point where they are satisfying their peak demand and reserve margin, then the demand curve slopes down very quickly. So there is some willingness to pay for additional capacity beyond what is actually needed on the system to meet reliability goals. But the value of that declines very rapidly. So like any economics 101, the market clearing price is where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. In this particular example, it was at $140 per megawatt day. And so all the generating capacity that was bid into the market is paid that market clearing price. That is the price that all generating resources are paid based on this, this market outcome. So the RPM, lots of acronyms, I apologize, that's kind of part of this industry. The reliability pricing model, the RPM, hosts what they call base residual auctions. These are auctions that are held annually, typically in May. And these auctions are for capacity that will be available 3 years in the future. It takes quite a bit of time for owners of generation to prepare their assets to be prepared to provide power in the future, or if you're developing new projects, there is a time lag between when you plan the project and when that project is available for providing capacity to the grid. So this BRA, again, is held in May, and it's for resources that would be available 3 years into the future. The last BRA that was held was in 2021, was for the 2021-2022 delivery year. So that's the year that the capacity would be expected to be online. And in that auction, they cleared 164,000 megawatts of capacity, and that represented a 22% reserve margin. So that was above the 15.8% reserve margin that is required to achieve the reliability standards. So they purchased a little bit more reserve capacity than was actually explicitly necessary. So the capacity market clearing price plays an important role for developers of new generation. It also plays an important role in terms of price discovery for companies that own generation, whether they're considering retiring that generation. So the amount of revenue that they can anticipate from providing this capacity service is an important function in terms of making overall business decisions. So with that really quick introduction to PJM's capacity market, that really brings us to the core of the issue that we're discussing here this afternoon. And that core issue is the competitiveness of these PJM's capacity market. So there have been concerns that have been raised over the years that the market is not operating efficiently. And this has been a concern since the inception of the capacity market back in 2006. And PJM has made adjustments to their market rules over the years, tried to address those concerns. However, those concerns really became to the forefront in 2018 when a variety of stakeholders brought before the FERC concerns that those state resources that were receiving incentives, subsidies from states, were bidding into PJM's market at an artificially low price, and that was depressing the market clearing prices. Therefore, those generators that weren't receiving state incentives or subsidies were not being adequately compensated for their capacity that they're bringing to the market. So the MOPR, as Hampton mentioned, had been around for a number of years, and there's really been targeted in very specific places. And as part of addressing the concerns that were raised before FERC, PJM did recommend some market rule changes, but those were largely rejected by the FERC. And in 2019, July 2019, FERC ordered PJM to postpone its planned 2022-2023 BRA. So there has not been a capacity auction through PJM since May of 2018. So this really issue started in 2018 and even prior in terms of the concern about the price suppression effects of state resources within PJM's capacity market. And this FERC December 2019 order is really just a continuation of this long drawn out process. And in 2019, again, FERC ruled that in order to address the price suppression effects that state subsidized resources have in PJM's capacity market, that they ordered a large expansion of the MOPR rule. So they want to apply this minimum offer price rule to all capacity resources that are benefiting from state subsidies. So again, as Hampton mentioned, MOPR, if a resource wants to bid into the capacity market, typically it would be able to determine the price that it wants to bid in to that market for. But the MOPR rule requires resources that are applicable to bid into the market at a predetermined price, which is administratively determined by PJM. So this was a massive expansion of the MOPR throughout PJM, and there are resources that are exempt, including existing resources. So this MOPR, except nuclear units will be subject to the MOPR based on the December 2019 order. However, existing capacity resources, including those existing solar and wind resources, would not be subject to the MOPR, be largely applied to new renewable resources. So the minimum offer price floor is established by PJM, as I mentioned. They have these net cone of new entry. The net cost of new entry, or net cone, is applied to new resources, and the price floor would be calculated by PJM for existing resources would be the avoidable cost rate, or net ARC. So this ruling, this massive expansion of MOPR to all capacity resources that are subject to or benefit from state incentives, and this includes resources that receive REC payments or resources that are part of standard offer auctions. Also, I noted in the slide that subsidies does not include federal subsidies, the investment tax credits that are given to solar and wind resources. But this order was quite controversial. There was one of the three FERC commissioners, Richard Glick, dissented, and a fairly strong articulation of that here in this quote: today's order he believed to be illegal, illogical, and truly bad public policy. So there are a variety of implications anticipated from the implementation of the 2019 MOPR order. It suggests that preliminary results of the net ACR, which we applied to multi-unit nuclear plants, would suggest that those plants should be able to clear the markets based on recent market clearing prices. However, the net cone preliminary estimates suggest that all new renewable capacity would not likely clear the capacity markets, the capacity auctions. Therefore, those resources would not generate a revenue stream from participation in PJM's capacity market. So that's a major concern in terms of states pursuing clean energy goals. If those resources are not generating revenue through capacity payments, then they have to generate revenue through other mechanisms. We'll get into that later in this webinar. I'll just conclude my section by saying, again, this has been very controversial. Many stakeholders have submitted requests for rehearing and clarification in response to the MOPR order, and this includes a request for a hearing and clarification by PJM. So I'm going to now turn it over to Jason. And so the FRR, the Fixed Resource Requirement Alternative, is really the one avenue that states have to pull out of PJM's capacity market and pursue their own acquisition of capacity resources to meet the reliability needs of the system. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason. Is Jason on the line?
Hi, sorry about that. I was just
Okay.
on mute. Apologies for the technical difficulties there. So thank you, Steve. As Steve just described, I'm going to be talking about how an entity would go about procuring capacity for the customers that it serves based on the fixed resource requirement alternative to participating in PJM's capacity market. So the FRR fixed resource requirement, or FRR alternative, is an option for load serving entities or utilities. Any organization that's serving distribution electricity customers can choose to acquire capacity for all of their customers outside of the PJM capacity market. And the types of entities that can select the FRR alternative are investor-owned utilities, or IOUs, public power authorities, and electric cooperatives. So all of the distribution electric companies. And one of the differences between the fixed resource requirement alternative and PJM's capacity market, or variable resource requirement, is that within the PJM capacity market, additional capacity can be procured if prices are low enough and supply is large enough based on the demand curve that Steve described in his part of the webinar. Whereas when an entity selects the fixed resource requirement, they're given a fixed number for how much capacity they need to procure to serve their customers. Next slide, please. So whenever a utility chooses the fixed resource requirement alternative, they become responsible for all capacity needed by all of their distribution service customers. And in particular, some states within the PJM footprint have restructured their electricity markets and allowing for retail choice, which means that some customers are purchasing energy and capacity from third-party competitive providers instead of from their local utility. And even in those states where a utility selects the FRR alternative, the utility will once again be responsible for procuring capacity instead of the competitive suppliers who would only provide energy in that situation. And when a utility selects the FRR alternative, they need to demonstrate that they have enough capacity for a period of at least 5 years. And that includes any projected load growth over that period. Next slide, please. So the timeline for selecting the fixed resource requirement starts long before the capacity is actually needed in parallel to the capacity market. An entity first needs to signal its interest in selecting the fixed resource requirement alternative 4 months before the auction that PJM holds to determine the capacity within the capacity market. And this election occurs for a minimum of a 5-year period, which means that utilities can't switch back and forth between the capacity market and the FRR alternative frequently. The final FRR plan, once an entity has selected the FRR alternative, is due to PJM 1 month before the capacity auction. And remember, once again, these auctions, or BRAs, are occurring 3 years before the capacity is actually needed. So there's about almost 3.5 year lag time between when a utility must first select the fixed resource requirement alternative and when they are finally providing that capacity to their customers. After 5 years of participating in the FRR alternative, utilities can choose to return to the PJM capacity market. They can do so by notifying PJM 2 months before the corresponding capacity auction, or BRA. And at that point, when the load serving entity or utility chooses to leave the FRR, they must stay in the PJM capacity market for at least 5 years. So again, there's no option to switch back and forth. Next slide. So one thing that utilities need to consider when thinking about the fixed resource requirement are potential transmission constraints within the PJM system, which, as Steve described, also occur within the PJM capacity market. Transmission constraints occur when there isn't enough capacity along long distance transmission lines for to serve all of the load within a specific region. And that means that some of the load is going to need to be served by local generation instead of generation coming in over these transmission lines. Regions that PJM considers potentially constrained areas are called locational deliverability areas, another acronym, or LDAs. For each LDA, a fraction of the capacity needed to serve all the load within that region needs to come from generation sources that are within the LDA. And that means that under the FRR alternative, a certain fraction of all the capacity procured has to be local capacity. And this requirement, or the fraction of capacity that has to be local, is called the minimum internal resource requirement, or the MIRR. And these LDAs can overlap with each other and can overlap with FRR service territories. So it's possible that, that an FRR service territory can include or be part of multiple different LDAs, in which case that the utility has to satisfy each of the applicable constraints of having an amount of capacity within each of the overlapping LDAs. Next slide. So this slide shows a map of the clearing prices in the last PJM capacity auction. So this is not showing the FRR alternative specifically, but it does give you a sense for what these transmission constraints can look like and what they can result in. So in the last auction, the PJM market overall cleared at a price of $140 per megawatt day, which you can see in the blue color in this map. But there are a number of other regions that had constraints, meaning that they needed capacity locally that was higher cost than capacity available in other portions of PJM. And so these are the constrained LDAs. And similarly, if any utilities within these areas that are not colored in blue were to enter a fixed resource requirement plan, they would need to procure a certain amount of capacity locally within their territory, which could once again be at a higher price than capacity available elsewhere. Next slide. So there are a number of opportunities that come with implementing the fixed resource requirement alternative. And the main opportunities here are to kind of counter some of the challenges and costs associated with FERC's MOPR order. So by selecting the FRR alternative, there's more opportunity for utilities and for states to increase their oversight of resource planning and to include renewable resources and new renewable resources that might otherwise be left out of the PJM capacity auctions in their resource plans, and therefore also compensate new renewable resources for the capacity value they're providing. This both streamlines state clean energy goals by providing renewable resources with another revenue stream, and it also can avoid the double counting or the double paying of procuring additional non-renewable capacity, which might occur in PJM's capacity market when renewable capacity isn't counted and isn't allowed in. So you reduce the potential for customers to be paying twice for that capacity. There are additional opportunities in how the FRR capacity procurement can be implemented or run. There's potential for fixed resource requirement capacity to be procured through competitive auctions to introduce some amount of competition, though less than in the PJM capacity market. And there's also potential for partnerships between utilities and between states, potentially, for joint procurements that could expand the scope of a procurement and increase the amount of competition, as well as the potential renewable resources, both existing and new, that could participate. Next slide. There are also a number of challenges associated with implementing the FRR. And some of these just have to do with the logistics of switching between the PJM capacity market and the fixed resource requirement. As we discussed earlier, there's quite a long lead time between when a utility first selects the fixed resource requirement and when they are actually responsible for providing capacity, when their capacity plan takes effect. So that lag time can be a challenge, and there's also potentially an additional lag as states and utilities try to come to a decision about whether the fixed resource requirement is the better option for them relative to the PJM capacity market. And that decision also introduces a number of challenges due to the various costs and benefits involved and the potential market power implications, some of which can be challenging to quantify and compare rigorously. Other challenges emerge due to the additional responsibilities that utilities and states would be taking on by taking more responsibility for resource planning overall. One of those, as an example, is the qualification of new resources, which is currently a role that PJM plays and could be a challenge for utilities and states in determining which new resources they can count on to come online 3 years later. There are additional concerns related to the smaller footprints of FRR service territories relative to the PJM capacity market overall. The smaller footprint can lead to reduced competition, especially when large fractions of the capacity need to be procured locally due to the small number of generation resources that may be available within a certain LDA. And it's also sometimes the case that those resources, there's a concentration of ownership among those resources in a single entity. And additionally, these regional or geographic constraints can limit the types of renewable energy available to include in an FRR plan. This is not as much of a problem in the short term when renewable penetration is still relatively low, and there's likely plenty of import capability to bring renewable generation or renewable capacity from elsewhere in PJM into these regions. But as renewable penetration increases and certain FRR entities need to begin finding renewable generation locally as well, that can be limiting when the solar and wind resources locally are not as strong as they are in other locations. And with that, I will turn it over to Courtney to talk about how states can take actions and pass legislation to support the FRR.
Thanks, Jason. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to provide an overview of some of the key considerations that states should take into account before proceeding with an FRR, as well as some of the key legislative and regulatory barriers states may face. This is not intended to be a one-size-fits-all presentation, as each state will definitely have its unique laws and regulations, but it's meant to be a broad overview. So as this slide shows, there is wide diversity across the PJM states in regards to whether they have a renewable portfolio standard or RPS, whether they have regulated or restructured electric markets, and if they have experience with an FRR option. For background and just to sort of level set, when I refer to restructured markets, these are states that have deregulated their electricity market so that the utilities are no longer allowed to own generation. Utilities in these states only own distribution assets, and customers in these states can choose to shop for electricity supply from competitive retail suppliers, or they can remain with their distribution utility and receive supply through what's often called standard offer service, that can also be referred to as basic service or default service. The factors shown on this slide will all impact a state's decision of whether to pursue the FRR and how complex that path will be. For example, while the FRR approach remains an option for both regulated and restructured states, including both investor-owned and publicly owned utilities, there are additional complexities for restructured states, which I'll speak to in the upcoming slides. These complexities are why there are only 2 current FRRs in the PJM region, mostly serving the regulated states. These are the American Electric Power FRR plan, which covers portions of Virginia, Indiana, and a small part of Michigan. And the second is the Duke Energy FRR plan, which serves Kentucky. Next slide. So this slide shows the key differences between regulated and restructured states and how it will impact the ability to implement an FRR. In the regulated states, you have vertically integrated utilities. They're allowed to own generation and use that generation to meet the demand of its customers. These utilities are able to evaluate and identify a mix of generation resources necessary to meet its customers' projected energy and capacity needs through integrated resource plans. And these can include building their own generation or contracting directly with generators. These plans and the resulting rates are then approved by state commissions. On the other hand, you have the restructured states, where the amount and type of new generation has been primarily determined by wholesale market forces, and resource planning has been largely removed from the Public Utility Commission and really the state in general. In these states, there are both there's electric distribution companies and competitive retail suppliers, and they're both procuring typically bundled energy and capacity from the wholesale market to meet customer demand. Important to note that for electric distribution companies, these contracts are typically between 1 to 3 years. And the standard offer service, it's primarily residential customers are served by that, whereas for retail suppliers, there's typically a significant portion of the large commercial and industrial customers that are being served by a competitive supplier. Next slide. So the ease in which to implement an FRR definitely depends on what type of state you're in. For regulated states, it definitely seems to be easier to implement the FRR option. The vertigrated integrated utilities are already procuring capacity on a per unit basis to meet all load in the service territory, which is a requirement of the FRR. However, even in regulated states, the PUC through regulation or even through legislation, that may need to be implemented to require the utilities to develop an FRR, because as of right now, it's voluntary whether or not the vertically integrated utilities want to go forward with the FRR. On the other hand, in restructured states, it's more difficult. First and foremost, you have a situation where both the utilities and the retail suppliers are procuring capacity for customers. As previously mentioned, the FRR requires the utility to procure capacity for all load in the FRR service area, including that load served by retail suppliers. In addition, many state laws that created electric restructuring and the existing standard offer service regulations don't allow utilities to sell capacity to retail suppliers. These states may also not have the necessary authority to require a utility to implement an FRR. These are some of the key reasons you only see 2 FRRs to date, and mostly in regulated states. This is because the FRR is an all or nothing choice. Utilities must either obtain all of their capacity requirements on their own or get it from the PJM market. Next slide. So specific to restructured states, these are some of the key issues that will need to be addressed to move forward with the FRR. First and foremost, as I've mentioned, electric restructuring laws may need to be amended. At a minimum, even if legislation is not required, a regulatory rulemaking will be needed to clarify what entity procures capacity and a system to allow retail suppliers to purchase capacity from utilities. Regardless of whether an FRR is implemented, there's 2 other items that will likely need to be addressed. The first is RPS Alternative compliance payment caps that may need to be amended. And this relates to whether renewable energy credit prices may need to increase in order to absorb that lost capacity revenue to clean energy resources. And that will impact how high your alternative compliance payment cap needs to go. The second relates to the fact that there's often legislation dictating bill impact thresholds for long-term contracts, specifically seen for things like offshore wind. And those may also need to be adjusted due to potential for increased prices. The second thing to consider is the procurement process and oversight. So for example, who's going to administer capacity procurement for the FRR? In some states, this may be easier if there's an existing entity. So for example, Illinois has the Illinois Power Agency, which is already overseeing electricity purchases for the state's two largest investor-owned utilities. And as many of you are aware, there's legislation in Illinois that would amend the current legal authority for the agency to procure capacity from renewable energy resources through the FRR option. A second question to determine is, how will the compensation value for capacity be calculated? And will that capacity be bundled with RECs and other load requirements? The next issue, which Jason touched upon before, is the timing barrier. So standard offer service is typically within regulation and typically 1 to 3 years, but the FRR is 5 years. So the length of these contracts may need to be amended to make sure it aligns with the FRR. Also, the timing of when these supply auctions take place also is often found in regulation and will need to be changed to ensure it aligns with the FRR. Lastly is the issue of competition. Many states' initial rationale for restructuring the electricity markets was to address the anti-competitive industry structure, improve service, and create better supply rates for customers. It will be important for states to think through how an FRR will impact retail competition, or is this moving back to more of a cost of service regulation structure? And as previously mentioned, states should examine if there is sufficient diversity of capacity resources in the FRR plan to create the necessary competition to create competitive pricing. Next slide. So in conclusion, for states contemplating the FRR option, it's really important to start with one key question, and that is, what is the issue you hope to resolve through the FRR? For most states, based on the comments to FERC, it's concern around meeting clean energy goals, greenhouse gas emissions, and avoiding paying twice for capacity. States with these concerns should address the following key questions when considering an FRR. First is, what are the generation resources you want to promote? Is that generation available in the FRR, taking into account minimum internal resource requirements that Jason discussed earlier? If not, the FRR may not provide the needed capacity payments to these clean energy resources. So you may still need to end up paying twice for capacity and having to increase your REC prices to make up that difference. Another point is, if you're concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, it's important to note, what is the generation mix in the proposed FRR plan versus how does it compare with the overall mix of PJM? What resources will you be incenting? And lastly, it will be important to do a cost-benefit analysis to figure out what are the costs of the FRR, including need for increased staffing, procurement, and oversight costs, versus the cost of incenting RPS resources through a different mechanism like higher REC prices. Next slide.
Okay, this is Steve again. I'll wrap up with just one conclusion slide, and then we'll have roughly 10 minutes to answer questions. I believe you can post questions, and Hamden will be reviewing those and managing that process. Just quickly in conclusion, FERC's December 19th, 2019 MOPR order is viewed as a major setback for state clean energy goals in that its new resources, new renewable energy resources will likely not be able to generate revenue through the capacity market that they have historically been able to, which is an important part of the overall economics of those resources. And secondly, there's been some analysis which suggests that if you're not able to account for that renewable capacity as part of the overall PJM requirement, that they will likely double pay for capacity, which could cause ratepayers billions of dollars of money dollars that they would incur over the next decade. For states, there's still a large degree of uncertainty on the benefits and costs of pursuing the FRR alternative, as Courtney discussed in her part of the presentation. However, there is uncertainty, but more information is coming out. In particular, tomorrow, PJM, based on FERC's timing, PJM should be submitting their compliance filing, which is, I believe, due out tomorrow, March 18th. And so that will yield additional information, which will allow states to evaluate the FRR alternative relative to continued participation in PJM's capacity market. And specifically, PJM is charged with setting the net cone and net ARC values, which would serve as the basis for the minimum offer prices that would be applied to MOPR resources. And as Hampton mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, Synapse is working on a guide. And again, there's a diversity of states and regulations across the PJM footprint, but this guide will provide some guidance in terms of a framework for assessing the economic costs and benefits, and a framework for evaluating the necessary legal and regulatory changes for states to consider for the FRR alternative. So with that, we do have about 10 minutes, and I'll turn it over to Hamden, and we're happy to take some questions.
Terrific. Sorry for cutting in there. Thank you, Steve, Jason, and Courtney, for that really informative overview of this important but complicated issue. As Steve said, we're now going to do questions, and we already have some in the queue, which is fantastic. But if any people have any other questions they would like to ask, feel free to ask it at the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom application. So the first question is, why does PJM sort of over-procure capacity? You know, for example, the reserve percentage is often greater than the reserve requirement. And does the FFR alternative present an opportunity to address or avoid this tendency going forward?
This is Steve. I'll take a first cut at that question. It's a great question. And really, the variable resource requirement, which is the basis for the PJM BRA's base residual auctions, and really it's kind of an economics fundamental 101. If the willingness to pay for additional capacity, as reflected in the demand curve, is greater than what the cost is, then it's economically efficient for PJM to procure additional capacity beyond the peak demand forecast and the reserve requirement. And it's really just a willingness to pay, that there is some increased value to overall customers based on the derived demand curve that PJM creates, which suggests that almost thinking of it as a bit of insurance, that you're buying additional capacity than perhaps is absolutely necessary. But again, the willingness to pay based on the demand and supply dynamics suggests that that would be economically efficient. So I guess that's kind of a quick answer to that first part. And then the second part is, yes, absolutely. The FRR would, the requirements would be based on, it's a fixed requirement, which is based on the forecasted peak demand for energy, plus the reserve margin that's required within PJM footprint of 15.8%. So there would be no incentive under that structure to purchase additional capacity beyond that requirement.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So our next question is, in restructured states under the FFR, are the utilities essentially double procuring the capacity for suppliers? Would the suppliers no longer procure capacity for their customers?
This is Jason.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I can take a first cut at this one, and I'll let Courtney add in any more information. the suppliers would no longer need to procure capacity. So in an FRR, the local utility takes full responsibility over providing capacity to all of its customers, even ones who are not currently on basic service.
Courtney, do you want to jump in there, or is that pretty much cover it?
Nope, that covers it. But that's definitely one of the key issues that would need to be addressed if a restructured state went with an FRR.
Perfect. So the next question is, what are the market power concerns that might arise due to the smaller procurement sizes and local capacity requirements under the FRR alternative?
I'm happy to take a first cut. So as in Jason's part of the webinar presentation, their FRR zone, there is this requirement, this minimum internal resource requirement. So there's, in order to, your FRR plan must procure a certain amount of generation that's within the FRR zone. And so the question is really how much capacity is available in the zone relative to what the minimum internal resource requirement is. And then secondly, what's the ownership of that capacity? Is that capacity owned by, say, one or two companies? And if so, then they could exercise market power. So the concern is, with the PJM region-wide base residual auction, there's lots of generation, there's lots of robust competition, and the notion is that you move to a more smaller geographic zone where there is some concentrated ownership, that there's the potential for market power where you would not be receiving a competitive price for the capacity that's available to you within your zone. I don't know if Max or Jason would like to add to that, or?
Sure, this is Jason. I think that's exactly right. Some of these LDAs are small enough that they really only have a handful of large local generators, which can mean that sometimes just one company owns almost all of the local generation, and therefore could theoretically overcharge for that capacity because there's really no way to establish an FRR without them.
Terrific. Okay, so looking ahead, are there any particular issues or discussions that states and stakeholders that are interested in learning more about the FRR alternative should be looking for in tomorrow's expected compliance filing by PJM on the MOPR order?
This is Max on the phone. I think one of the things to look for is what PJM will sort of determine to be the finalized ACR prices and net cones. I think that will be very important. And I think the other thing to look for are clarifications that PJM may have regarding some of the standard offer service and some of the questions raised by Commissioner Glick in his dissent.
This is Steve, and thanks, Mac. I'll just add, there are still a good bit of outstanding questions. There was quite a few requests for clarification. And just to build on what Max said, there was clarification about state resources that participate in RECs, mandatory RECs, compliance REC programs. Obviously, those would be, the MOPR would be applicable to those resources. And then there's been a question about resources that are participating in voluntary REC programs. And so there's basic unclarity whether those resources should be exempt from the MOPR because they're not actually driven, the REC payments aren't driven by state policy, they're just driven by voluntary organizations, companies that are looking to purchase renewable energy certificates or credits for their generation that they consume. So that's just one issue that of others that are still yet unresolved.
Fantastic. And then I think we have time for one last question, and it is, does the footprint of the area served by an FRR alternative have to be contiguous?
This is Jason. That's a good question. So I don't believe there is a requirement that that is the case, but the entity that enters the FRR is a single load serving entity. So there are limits to how large the FRR could be, but there are opportunities for cooperation between various load serving entities and distribution utilities to procure capacity in a more cooperative manner to potentially serve customers within a larger footprint.
And this is Courtney. I'll just add to that that the American Electric Power FRR plan I mentioned is quite large, covering Virginia, Indiana, and parts of Michigan, and it's made up of the operating companies, Appalachian Power Company and Indiana Michigan Power. So that is an example of where you have a larger area and multiple operating companies working together.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone who participated and attended this webinar. We really appreciate it. And if you have any follow-up questions from today's webinar, you can email me at hampton.macbeth@nyu.edu, yeah, that would be great. So anyway, thank you so much, and thank you for attending.
Okay, thank you everyone, and please feel free to reach out to any of us at Synapse if you have additional follow-up questions. And thank you, Hampton, for the opportunity. We appreciate it.
Perfect, thank you. Goodbye.